In August of 1987, in a quiet prison courtyard in Berlin, an old man was helped onto a wooden bench. He moved slowly, not because he was weak, but because time itself had weighed him down. He was 93 years old. The wall behind him was high. The door behind that wall was locked, and beyond it, the world no longer resembled the one he had known. Germany had fallen, then split, then rejoined. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall was cracking. A new generation had grown old without remembering the war at all. But this man remained exactly where he had been for decades. He was not waiting for trial. He was not awaiting execution. He was not preparing for release. He was simply still there, the last prisoner of the Second World War. Not a metaphor, not a title. A fact. His name was Rudolf Hess. And the most important thing about his story is not what he did during the war, but what happened after it was over. Most World War II stories end with a date. May 8th, 1945, September 2nd, 1945. Victory, defeat, liberation, collapse. But for some individuals, the war did not end. It simply changed form. For Rudolf Hess, the bombs stopped falling long before the world stopped judging him. This is not a story about ideology, not a story about battlefield decisions, not a story about power. It is a story about consequence, about what a man carries when the system he helped create is destroyed. But his responsibility remains intact. When Allied troops moved through Germany in 1945, they did not find Rudolf Hess hiding in bunkers or attempting escape. He had been in captivity since 1941, 4 years before the war ended. By then, he was no longer part of Nazi decision-making, no longer issuing orders, no longer influencing events. And that fact would later complicate everything. Because the question was no longer, what crimes did Rudolf Hess commit during the war? But rather, what does responsibility look like when the crime is helping a system exist? If you value slow, reflective World War II stories that focus on aftermath rather than combat, please consider liking and subscribing to WW2 Diaries. It helps us continue telling these long-form human stories. Now let's return to Rudolf Hess. Many senior Nazi figures met definitive ends. Some took their own lives. Some were executed. Some were sentenced and later released. These endings created closure. Rudolf Hess did not receive closure. Instead, he received time, decades of it. And time, unlike death, allows consequence to unfold slowly. When Allied leaders prepared the Nuremberg trials, they believed they were constructing a clear moral ledger: crimes, evidence, verdicts, sentences. But Rudolf Hess did not fit neatly into any category. He had been Deputy Führer, Hitler's closest political ally in the 1930s, a key figure in shaping Nazi law and structure. Yet, he was absent during the Holocaust, absent during wartime decisions, absent from genocide planning, and still, the system bore his fingerprints. This made Hess an uncomfortable defendant. Not a monster in action, but a collaborator in creation. At the trial, Hess appeared detached, sometimes confused, sometimes distant, sometimes strangely calm. Then he announced something that stunned the courtroom. He claimed complete amnesia, no memory of his rise within the Nazi Party, his relationship with Hitler, his political authority, his decisions. Psychiatrists were brought in. Evaluations were conducted. Debates unfolded quietly behind closed doors. Was he lying? Was he broken? Was his mind protecting itself? No consensus emerged. But the judges reached a conclusion that would define the post-war moral framework. Memory is not a requirement for responsibility. You do not have to remember what you helped create for it to remain yours. Rudolf Hess was sentenced to life imprisonment. Not execution, not parole, not a fixed term. Life. At first glance, this appeared merciful. But life imprisonment does something execution does not. It allows consequence to continue. It demands endurance, and it denies closure. Spandau Prison stood in Berlin as a relic of the 19th century, built for hundreds, guarded by 4 Allied powers: United States, United Kingdom, France, Soviet Union. At first, 7 men were imprisoned there. Each represented a different aspect of the Nazi leadership. Over time, one by one, they were released. Not pardoned, but released after serving their sentences. By 1966, only one remained, Rudolf Hess. At that moment, Spandau stopped being a prison in the traditional sense. It became a monument, a physical reminder that some consequences do not expire. By the 1960s, Hess was no threat. He was elderly, isolated, medically fragile, but release required unanimous agreement from all four Allied powers. And the Soviet Union refused. Why? Because release would signal forgiveness, and forgiveness would risk reinterpretation. The fear was not what Hess would do, but what others would do with his freedom. A released Hess could become a symbol, a martyr, a rallying point, and so he stayed. Not because of danger, but because of meaning. Hess's daily routine was rigid. Wake at the same time, eat alone, exercise alone, read under supervision, sleep under observation. Letters were censored, visits were rare. Conversation was minimal. This was not punishment by pain. It was punishment by time. Each day identical, each year indistinguishable from the last. A life reduced to routine. Decades of isolation reshaped the mind. Hess became suspicious of food, obsessed with routine, preoccupied with minor grievances. Doctors disagreed on diagnosis. Some believed he was paranoid. Others believed he was manipulative. Some believed he was simply old and alone. But all agreed on one thing. No human being is meant to live like this indefinitely. And yet, that was the sentence. At some point, every guard who worked Spandau faced the same silent question: is this justice or endurance? No answer was ever written down. By the time Rudolf Hess entered old age, his punishment was no longer about law. It was about memory. Spandau existed so the world would not forget what the Nazi system produced, even when the system itself was gone. And Hess became its final witness, not by choice, but by survival. The war had ended. The trials had ended. But Rudolf Hess's life had not resolved. By the late 1950s, Spandau Prison no longer felt like a prison, not in the ordinary sense. There were no new inmates, no intake procedures, no release schedules posted on walls. Time did not flow forward there. It simply repeated itself. Rudolf Hess woke each morning to the same sounds, the same footsteps, the same keys, the same silence. Outside the walls, West Berlin was rebuilding. Cafes reopened. Children were born who would never know the war. Inside Spandau, nothing aged except the man. Life imprisonment is often imagined as severe because it is final. But Hess's punishment was severe because it was prolonged. Every year that passed changed the meaning of his sentence. In the immediate post-war years, imprisonment was understandable. It was expected. It was part of accountability. But as decades passed, the question quietly shifted. Not spoken aloud, not written into law, but felt. At what point does punishment stop addressing the crime and begin existing for its own sake? No one officially asked this question, but everyone involved felt its weight. Spandau Prison was governed jointly by four Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union. Every administrative decision required agreement, including release. By the 1950s, the Western powers had quietly concluded that Hess no longer posed a threat. He was elderly, politically irrelevant, medically fragile, but the Soviet position never changed. Release was refused every time, without explanation, not because of what Hess might do, but because of what his release might mean: forgiveness, leniency, historical softening. And so the stalemate remained. Hess stayed. Hess's daily routine was documented in prison logs with clinical precision. Wake up at a fixed hour, morning exercise in the yard, alone. Breakfast, eaten alone. Reading, approved materials only. Lunch, more isolation. Dinner, lights out. Every movement was observed, every interaction regulated. Guards rotated monthly between Allied powers. Uniforms changed. Languages changed. Hess did not. Human beings do not require conversation to survive, but they require recognition. For Hess, recognition disappeared. He was no longer addressed as a political figure, not as a defendant, not even as a symbol. He was addressed as a task, something to be managed, maintained, observed. Over time, silence became his primary relationship. And silence does not argue. It does not accuse. It does not forgive. It simply waits. As the years passed, Hess's physical world became smaller. The prison library shrank. Privileges were reduced. Movement slowed. Eventually, his world consisted of a cell, a small exercise yard, a dining room, a medical room, four walls repeated endlessly. The outside world existed only through censored letters and newspapers, often delayed or redacted. History reached him late, sometimes not at all. Age did what punishment could not. Hess developed chronic illnesses, digestive problems, ulcers, arthritis, heart weakness. He complained constantly, often refused medication, claimed poisoning. Doctors disagreed. Some saw paranoia. Others saw manipulation. Others saw the natural deterioration of a man deprived of normal human life. But there was no disagreement on one point. This was not how human beings were meant to age. Many guards assigned to Spandau entered believing they were guarding a dangerous man. Most left with a quieter realization. They were guarding time itself, and time does not fight back. As Hess's physical power diminished, his symbolic power quietly grew. Outside the prison, fringe groups began to reinterpret his captivity. They did not see a collaborator, a political enabler, a man who helped build a criminal state. They saw an old man alone, a sentence without end, a punishment they claimed exceeded justice. Hess himself did nothing to encourage this, but symbolism does not require consent. By the 1960s, the possibility of release created a new problem. If Hess were freed, he could become a rallying point. His death outside prison could be mythologized. His presence could distort memory. If he remained imprisoned, he would quietly disappear. His story would remain unresolved. Responsibility would remain visible. So authorities chose the option that controlled memory. They kept him. With no audience, Hess turned inward. He wrote obsessively, tracked grievances, cataloged routines. Small changes disturbed him. Furniture moved. Food temperature altered. Lighting adjusted. Control became survival. When the outside world offers no agency, the mind creates its own. By the early 1970s, something fundamental had changed. Rudolf Hess was no longer serving a sentence. He was the sentence. Spandau Prison existed because he existed. Budgets were approved because he remained alive. Guards were stationed because he continued breathing. The prison no longer responded to crime. It responded to persistence. If punishment continues after its purpose is fulfilled, what remains, justice or ritual? No official report ever answered this. Even the guards were affected. Many described the assignment as unsettling, not frightening, not dangerous, but heavy. Watching a man grow old alone, watching days repeat endlessly, watching history refuse to conclude. Some requested transfers, others coped through detachment. No one left unchanged. Execution would have ended the story. Release would have transformed it, but Hess remained suspended between the two, alive and observed, unresolved, and that suspension carried its own moral weight. By this stage of his life, Hess was no longer paying for what he did. He was paying for what he represented, and representation is heavier than guilt, because it does not diminish with time. As the decades continued, Hess entered extreme old age. His body weakened, his mind narrowed, his world shrank further. But something else happened. The prison itself began to outlive its justification. And the question shifted again, not about guilt, not about danger, but about what responsibility looks like when only memory remains. He was living inside a question. The war was now a generation away. Young guards entering Spandau had been born after 1945. Some had parents who barely remembered ration cards, let alone Nuremberg. Outside the prison walls, the language had changed. People spoke of reconstruction, of reconciliation, of European unity. Inside Spandau, none of that applied. The same walls, the same procedures, the same solitary man. Punishment, once a response to crime, had become something else entirely. It had become memory enforced by architecture. Justice, to remain justice, must be able to move. Not quickly, not emotionally, but responsively. By the 1970s, Hess's imprisonment no longer responded to threat, capability, intent. It responded only to precedent. Every year he remained incarcerated was justified by the year before, not because anyone had reevaluated his guilt, but because no one wanted to be responsible for changing the meaning of the sentence. In that way, responsibility itself froze. Rudolf Hess had not spoken publicly in decades. He had issued no statements, no manifestos, no ideological reminders. Yet outside Spandau, his name resurfaced, not through his voice, but through others. Fringe groups reframed him. They did not talk about his role in shaping Nazi law, his proximity to Hitler, his contribution to legitimizing a criminal regime. They talked about his age, his isolation, the length of his imprisonment. They reduced a system builder to a solitary old man. And in doing so, they attempted to detach consequence from cause. No one feared Hess's actions anymore. They feared interpretation. History, once settled, can be reopened through narrative. And Hess's continued imprisonment prevented a dangerous transformation. If he were released, even quietly, the story could be rewritten, not by historians, but by those who benefit from ambiguity. So Spandau remained, not as a prison, but as a barrier against revision. Spandau Prison required hundreds of personnel, international coordination, constant funding, all for one man who could barely walk. This absurdity was intentional. It sent a message. Some crimes create consequences that are inconvenient to conclude. The prison existed not for Hess, but for what the world wanted to remember through him. As Hess entered his 80s, his health declined sharply. Vision loss, severe arthritis, digestive disorders, chronic weakness. He required assistance to walk, to eat, to dress. And yet the prison protocols remained unchanged. The guards rotated, the rules applied, the walls stood firm. It was no longer about managing a prisoner, it was about maintaining a position. At this stage, compassion became politically dangerous. To show leniency could be interpreted as weakness, forgetfulness, moral fatigue. To maintain imprisonment could be interpreted as cruelty, obsession, ritualized punishment. There was no morally clean option, and so authorities chose continuity, not because it was right, but because it was stable. At what point does remembering become punishment? And punishment become performance? No document ever addressed this directly, but every year Hess remained alive inside Spandau, the question grew heavier. Inside the prison, Hess aged quietly. He no longer argued as often, no longer protested minor changes with the same intensity. His world narrowed to physical sensation, pain, fatigue, hunger, sleep. Ideology did not sustain him. Memory did not comfort him. He lived moment to moment, a human being reduced to endurance. Many guards later described the assignment as emotionally disorienting, not frightening, not threatening, but hollow. They were not guarding a criminal in the usual sense. They were guarding a decision made decades earlier. Some felt pity, others resisted it. Most learned to suppress reaction altogether. Spandau trained detachment. By the late 1970s, Germany itself had transformed. A new generation confronted the past through education, memorials, and public discourse. Unlike earlier decades, responsibility was now openly discussed. Ironically, this made Hess's continued imprisonment even more anomalous. Society was learning. But the sentence was static, and still no one intervened. As Hess approached 90, some quietly suggested that nature would resolve the issue. Death would end the logistical burden, remove the symbol, close the case. But even death carried risk. Where would he be buried? How would the site be treated? Who would control the narrative? Even his dying was politically sensitive. Authorities understood something crucial. If Hess died outside prison, a place could be claimed. A story could be shaped. A meaning could be assigned. By keeping him inside Spandau until the end, they controlled context. His life would end where responsibility began. At some point, Spandau stopped being about justice. It became about containment, not of a man, but of interpretation. By 1987, Hess was frail, nearly blind, barely mobile, dependent on assistance. He spent time in the garden house within the prison grounds, alone, supervised, contained. The world outside prepared for new political chapters. Inside, one final chapter remained unwritten. By this stage, Rudolf Hess was no longer a political actor. He was a moral artifact, a reminder that systems outlive individuals. Responsibility does not dissolve with time. Some consequences are meant to be uncomfortable. He did not redeem himself. He did not escape judgment. He endured it, not an ending, but an aftermath that continues. On the morning after Rudolf Hess died, Spandau Prison was silent. Not dramatically silent, not ceremonially silent, just empty. For decades, the prison had existed for a single purpose: to hold one man. Now that purpose was gone, and yet nothing felt resolved. Because Hess's death did not answer the question his life had raised. It merely transferred it. History often treats death as conclusion, a final punctuation mark, a clean ending. But in this case, death complicated matters. Because Rudolf Hess had not been imprisoned only as a man, he had been imprisoned as meaning. And meaning does not die with the body. Within weeks of Hess's death, Allied authorities made a decision that stunned many observers. Spandau Prison would be destroyed. Not closed, not converted, not preserved, demolished. Every wall, every cell, every courtyard. The stones were crushed, the rubble removed, the ground redeveloped. Why such urgency? Because Spandau itself had become dangerous, not physically, symbolically. Authorities understood something deeply uncomfortable. If Spandau remained, it would become a destination, a place where stories would gather, a place where narratives could be shaped, a place where responsibility might be rewritten. A prison meant to enforce memory, risked becoming a shrine that distorted it. And so they erased it, not to forget, but to prevent reinterpretation. Rudolf Hess's life had been tightly controlled for decades. His letters, his visitors, his movement. After his death, the same logic applied. Control the context or lose the meaning. The demolition of Spandau was not about hiding history. It was about closing a space where myth could grow. Even burial became a problem. Where should Rudolf Hess be laid to rest? A public grave could become a rallying point. A hidden grave could become a mystery. Eventually, his burial site became controversial anyway. Visitors came, symbols appeared. Authorities monitored quietly. Years later, even the grave was removed, because memory once again proved unstable. Rudolf Hess left behind no public apology, no confession, no reconciliation. He did not attempt redemption. He did not explain himself. But absence is also a form of legacy. What he left behind was not a message, but a problem. Rudolf Hess forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Some crimes are not about action, but about creation. He did not order mass murder. He did not command armies. But he helped normalize a system that made those things possible. And when that system collapsed, he lived long enough to experience what remained. There was no moment of catharsis in Hess's story. No speech, no apology, no release. Just years, then decades, then silence. This is responsibility without spectacle. And it is far harder to live with than dramatic punishment. Guilt is personal. It belongs to the individual. Consequence is structural. It belongs to history. Hess carried both. But what defined his post-war life was not guilt. It was consequence. A consequence that did not ask whether he remembered, did not ask whether he repented, did not ask whether he still believed. It simply existed. As time passes, history becomes easier to simplify. People want villains who die clearly, heroes who suffer briefly, endings that reassure. Rudolf Hess offers none of that. He offers duration, persistence, unresolved weight. He shows us that ending a war does not end responsibility. Destroying a system does not erase its builders. Time does not automatically heal moral damage. It is tempting to see Hess as an anomaly, a strange case, an exception. But his story warns us against that comfort. Systems are built slowly, with paperwork, with loyalty, with belief, and those who help build them do not always disappear when they collapse. Sometimes they live on inside the aftermath. By the end, Rudolf Hess was not a leader, a symbol, a voice. He was a human being, living inside the longest consequence of his life. No audience, no power, no future, only continuation. Execution ends suffering. Imprisonment without end extends it. But the quietest punishment of all is being forced to live without resolution. That was Hess's fate. We are left with a question that history does not answer for us. What should justice look like? When a man is no longer dangerous, but his past still is, there is no universal answer. And perhaps that is the point. Rudolf Hess's story does not end, because the questions it raises are still with us. About responsibility, about memory, about what societies choose to remember, and how they enforce that memory. As long as those questions remain, his aftermath remains relevant. Rudolf Hess did not die as a hero. He did not live as a martyr. He did not redeem himself. He lived on, inside consequence, inside memory, inside responsibility that did not fade, and that may be the most unsettling legacy of all. But before we leave this story, there is one more layer worth sitting with. One of the most difficult things to understand about Rudolf Hess's post-war life is not the severity of his punishment, but its shape. There was no countdown, no date circled on a calendar, no sentence to cross off year by year, no moment to anticipate. For most prisoners, time moves toward something. A review, a hearing, a possibility. For Hess, time did not move toward anything. It simply accumulated. Life imprisonment is often described as harsh because it is long, but length alone is not what defines suffering. Direction does. Hess's punishment lacked direction. There was no sense of progression, only repetition. Days followed days, years followed years, without alteration, without reassessment. In such conditions, time ceases to function as time. It becomes weight. Human identity is not static. We understand ourselves through change of who we were, who we are becoming, what we have endured, what we still expect. Remove expectation, and identity begins to erode. For Hess, there was no after, no imagined future, no reintegration, no social return, only maintenance. He was not preparing to re-enter society. He was being preserved outside it. Psychologists understand that indefinite confinement produces a specific mental condition. Not despair, not panic, but flattening. Emotions dull, reactions slow. Concern narrows to the immediate. Hess's fixation on routine, food temperature, furniture placement, lighting, was not unusual. It was adaptive. When the world offers no control, the mind creates micro-domains of authority. Control becomes survival. Hess did not engage in confession. He did not seek absolution. He did not debate his guilt publicly. This silence is often misunderstood as defiance, but silence can also signal exhaustion. By the later decades of his imprisonment, Hess had nothing left to defend. No audience, no allies, no cause to advance. What remained was endurance. Endurance is rarely discussed as punishment, but in Hess's case, endurance was the punishment. Not suffering in bursts, not dramatic moments of reckoning, but the daily requirement to continue existing. Inside a space designed to remember his past, each morning required participation in a system that reminded him, without speaking, why he was there. That reminder never softened. Over time, even meaning itself becomes fragile. Why wake? Why eat? Why complain? Hess's later years show signs not of rebellion, but of diminishment. He did not argue because arguing assumes someone is listening. He did not protest because protest assumes change is possible. He endured because endurance required no belief. Most lives are stories. They have beginnings, middle chapters, resolutions. Hess's post-war life had none of that. It was not a narrative. It was a condition. And living inside a condition, rather than a story, is one of the most psychologically demanding states a human can experience. Hess's life forces us to confront a difficult idea. Punishment does not need spectacle to be total. Sometimes the absence of drama is precisely what makes consequence inescapable. When people discuss accountability after World War II, they often focus on visible endings, trials, executions, sentences handed down from benches. But Hess's story belongs to a different category. It asks what accountability looks like when the world chooses continuation over closure. Executions provide certainty. They draw a line. They allow societies to say, this has been dealt with. Even imprisonment with a fixed term allows for resolution. Hess's sentence did neither. It kept the question alive. And that discomfort was intentional. Hess never delivered a final statement, never issued a reckoning, never clarified his inner beliefs. This absence frustrated many observers. But silence has its own moral gravity. Without explanation, the burden shifts outward. The world must decide what the silence means. Other figures spoke, defended themselves, reframed their actions. Hess did not. This did not make him virtuous, but it made his aftermath different. There was no narrative to challenge, no redemption to debate, only the sustained presence of consequence. The decision to keep Hess imprisoned was not about vengeance, it was about memory discipline. Release would have allowed reinterpretation. Imprisonment prevented it. This was not justice aimed at the individual, but justice aimed at historical clarity. Time has a tendency to blur responsibility. Decades pass, witnesses fade, contexts dissolve. Hess's continued imprisonment functioned as resistance to that drift. It reminded the world that systems are built by people. Early architects matter. Absence from later crimes does not erase foundational responsibility, but remembering is not free. It demands maintenance, resources, attention. It forces societies to keep discomfort alive. Spandau Prison was expensive, not financially, but ethically. It required sustained commitment to an unresolved truth. When Hess died, authorities dismantled Spandau quickly. This was not contradiction, it was completion. Once the living reminder was gone, the structure itself risked becoming distortion. Memory had to shift from architecture to historical understanding. Rudolf Hess does not represent repentance. He does not represent redemption. He represents the long shadow of participation, the cost of helping build something that later destroys millions, even if you are absent when it happens. His life leaves us with no comfortable answers, only a question that remains relevant far beyond 1945. How should societies treat those whose greatest crime was helping make catastrophe possible? Hess lived the rest of his life inside that question, and in doing so, he ensured it would not disappear quietly. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world. And if someone in your family served, tell us. These stories don't disappear when they're shared. They stay alive.